Well, without much further introduction, I hope everybody is here. Also, our two other speakers who will join us online. So we start with the paper of Gajendran Ayyathurai. I hope I got it right. Who at the moment is a research fellow at the Center for Modern Indian Studies at Göttingen University here in Germany, but he has already also taught at Columbia University, in New York and in New Jersey. His work concentrates on religion, caste, gender, and the history of modern India. And I just mentioned his forthcoming book, Deep Resistance, Buddhism, Caste, and the Marginalized in Colonial India. Yeah, and I think that should do for the moment, and the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Am I audible? Yeah, good. Thank you really so much for the organizers. It's a tough thing, and we all feel very warm to be part of this conference. It's amazing feeling. So thank you, Claudio and Barbara and friend Zina Klaus, who couldn't be here. Hi, Zina, hope you're hearing. Congratulations on the delivery of your son. I'm glad to hear both of you are doing great. So it's really a pleasure. And I've right from the keynote speaker, Professor Bernal, and I've been learning a lot that really reinforces what I'm thinking on the problem of what I call on the problem of caste in India. So it's been fantastic. I'm really, digesting, and I'm going to use a lot of the speaker's contribution in this conference as I go in my writing. And also, I'm really privileged to be part of this gender panel. I'm very glad to share with you, one of my pieces is just out in the Journal of Women's History from Johns Hopkins University, and it is called Critical Caste Feminism. Some ideas of it are already out, and I'm building on them now in a most powerful way. This presentation also going to be turned into a paper, and so I'm grateful to be here, to you all for the invitation and to be part of you. Okay, this is the title, The Limits of Caste and Gender in Postcolonial Theory Towards Critical Caste Feminism. And how many minutes do I have?
15.
15? Okay, then I have to really rush, okay. So here is the plan. So I'm going to talk about something about caste and gender inequality as the foundations of India. Clearly, I don't look at it as colonial foundation. It is a pre-colonial foundation. I have my own justifications and references. And then I'm beginning to think about what is called how caste, like race, has been enforced in India. Therefore, I call it as modes of caste enforcement. And I see 3 modes. And that led to sort of what I call malignant Brahminism, very violent, physically violent kind of what is called Brahminism, comes from the word Brahmin, an exclusionary group in India. And then through this post-colonial theory, then third part I'm going to talk about is, how a particular form of caste-based Hindu identity has come into being, especially in the West. That I call benign Brahminism, a very benevolent Brahminism, a condescending Brahminism. And then finally, vis-a-vis this, as many of you spoke today, there are exemplars, there are pioneers, anti-caste pioneers, and about whom my doctoral work at Columbia is from those, what I call archives of the oppressed. That's my phrase, archives of the oppressed. And they've been publishing 100 years ago about their body against caste, about their castelessness. So it is from there I derived this powerful, intellectually self-emancipating thing called, category and work called critical caste feminism. It's from the South Indian exemplars. From the South Indian exemplars, I have this conceptualization called critical caste feminism. So it's from within India. So, and then I have recently initiated a new subfield regarding South Asia. It's called critical caste studies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and conclude all that very quickly. So in this slide, the how I say the foundation of the foundation of caste and gender. Sorry, the slide is a little cluttered. So what is Brahminism? So the caste is connected with the, a group called Brahmins, who are not even 5% of India's population. Okay, and And the moment somebody says, I am a Brahmin, that person is not a good Brahmin or a bad Brahmin. He is clearly an exclusionary person. The moment I say I am a Brahmin, there is nothing good about me. I exclude you. I mean, whites, black, everybody, right? So it is exclusionary. And what do I mean? So religio-economic, historical privilege of minority caste groups called Brahmins, who are not even 5%. Interchangeably, I'm going to use 5% vis-a-vis the 95% hereafter. So, and they have the power to prescribe. They means Brahmins. The 5% have the power to prescribe and proscribe non-Brahmins by denying equal status and wealth. That is by birth. So any of you who are non-Brahmin, who's fundamentally by birth, you are inferior to a Brahmin. Let's get that clear. There is no dualism on that. So there is systematized violence is involved in this, right? So how does this identity of a Brahmin happens? Through temple, through religious identity, and then residence. Where do they live? What food they eat? It's got to be pure vegetarian, as if there is some food called pure vegetarian. I'm not sure. So pure vegetarian. Then sex. Who should have sex with who? Clear restriction. And bodily mutilation if there is a violation. Okay, consensual sex is prone to bodily mutilation. So who should educate, who should not? Again, Brahmins determine. Who should do what work? They cannot do a so-called janitorial work. Cleaning the toilet is not for a Brahmin. Only the temple priesthood. Even a Brahmin woman can never be a priestess in a temple, even today, even in America or in Europe. So this is why I call it malignant Brahminism, violent Brahminism, malevolent Brahminism, and it comes from the group Brahmins. And they have normativized and naturalized these ideas, and other communities are forced to emulate. So you have Kshatriya power. Kshatriya is another community. Vaishya is another community. Shudras are supposed to be lower caste. Even they fight among themselves. This codification, but primarily comes from Brahmins. So it goes on. And there is, now we talk about Hindu majoritarianism. If I ask you, you'd say India is a Hindu country, but this category wasn't even popular 120 years ago. This was clearly a European invention. There are enough evidences. Look at the title of P.J. Marshall's book, European discovery of European invention of Hinduism, 1971 book. The British discovery of Hinduism, 1971. So they put together the references, and so this category is a recent one. Before that is only the category called Brahmin and Brahminhood and all that. Okay, so and there is this ancient modern connection into this Hindu majoritarianism, and there is this now famous sociologist called, he passed away, is called M.N. Srinivas. He wrote a book called Sanskritization. Actually, he was a Brahmin. He wanted to call it as Brahminization, but decided to call it Sanskritization. That I think is clearly a work of romanticizing Brahminism, both malevolent as well as benign. That's my. And then Brahmin male power. All this codification, comes from Brahmin males. Brahmin females don't have a voice. If they menstruate, they can't even go to into a temple. Like I said, they can't become a priestess. So bodily violence, they continue to suffer today. So if you want to trace the history of Brahmin women, you can't go beyond 300 years. Stephanie Jemison, a famous, Sanskritist whose work has clearly shown that. So Brahmin male power, we need to take it seriously. And therefore, there are caste and gender inequalities are the foundation of India's history, pre-colonial history. It's like US racial foundation from 1619. Caste foundation in India comes from Vedic period. So as I was writing my dissertation at Columbia, I was working on anti-caste organic intellectuals from India by discovering their materials for the first time, their own written publications from late 19th century, early 20th century. And they were attacking Brahminism. I didn't have anybody helping me conceptually with that, including the post-colonial theorists who were working in Columbia at the time. So I began to sort of work on this concept, but thankfully now there is a book. Look at the title of the book, powerful book, How the Brahmins Won, written by a Sanskritist called Johannes Bronckhorst. I love the title. And the second part is very important, from Alexander to the Guptas. It is out into, so there he defines Brahminism, and clearly he says, okay, that's scary. So how he clearly points out how the civil societal institutions such as temples played a very crucial role in Brahmin power coming into being. So he shows. So the civil societal aspects of Brahminism, one has to take seriously. And then he also points out how the Brahmins have used the state and imposed their power. So the state has always played a crucial role, not from colonial time, from pre-colonial time. And he shows us all these are quotes from that book, by the way. And then finally, how Sanskrit has been the sacred language of only Brahmins. I've written a piece on German, criticizing this, why this is just a repository of Brahmin males, right? So the piece, understand, thankfully in German university, now German departments are, Sanskrit departments are closing. I welcome that, because it's been the privilege of Brahmins from 1818, when the chair was established in Bonn University. Clearly, a minority group from India has been traveling back and forth and enjoying Sanskrit, and this has to close. So I want you to keep in mind the three connections: civil, societal, state, and the academy they've been playing a very crucial role in the establishment of Brahminism. Now, I am speaking to you from Germany. This is what Bronco says. Suddenly, in a Sanskrit book, voluminous book, he jumps to analyze the connections between Brahminism and Narcissism. I was stunned. And he says how Hitler in the 1930s was establishing a museum in which he put things about Greeks and Romans, while in 1930s, Germany was a powerful industrial country. In that museum, there was nothing connected with modern Germany was there. So in a way, Bronco says the Brahmins are like that. They talk about the ancientness and ruin and rupture the 95% of population. He shows that. From there, I started thinking, okay, we know Hitler was an influence on some Hindu writers in India, but what we do not know is the pre-colonial Brahminical influence in the very evolution of Narcissism is important for us to study. So are there Brahmin male influences in the very emergence of Nazi values? We have not touched upon, we got to do it, and that's the thing. So I move to the next slide. And then, so from this, the 3 points, we need to understand civil societal institutions, how temple, for instance, establishes casteism in India. So every temple is problematic in India. There is no inclusive temple, especially that is called Hindu or Brahminical deity-based temple. So let's not romanticize. Please go check in Berlin, there's a temple, the priest would be a Brahmin male, right? So this we have not problematized anthropologically, sociologically. What does that temple do? Is it inclusive or exclusive? Yeah. And then the state. State functions for who? Is it for all or only for the Brahmins? And so we need to question academy. Postcolonial theory is, like I said in the morning, is controlled by almost all of them are Brahmins. Ask yourself which non-Brahmin you came across when. Have you ever come across a middle-class person or a lower-class person? Why? So invariably, there are Marxists, there are liberals, there are postcolonial theorists, all from Brahmins, the 5%. So 95% don't come to the Western institutions so far. So now, thankfully, in my center in Germany, we are beginning to do that. Okay, this is like a brick wall. There is no inclusiveness. Caste is a brick wall. You can't cut it through. You can't break through. Hindu identity is not inclusive. It is hierarchical. It is a brick wall. You can't break through. It's like the diversity inclusiveness. This is from Sarah Ahmed, right? How you talk about diversity policy, yet you don't bring the people at the center. So that metaphor is useful for me. So therefore, I call Western post-colonial Brahminism. I don't call it as like simply post-colonialism, post-colonial theory. I call it now Western post-colonial Brahminism is thriving. Here you go, Gajendran Ayyatthurai's book on temple, which was published in 1981. He calls himself, his mother and father as Ayyar. Ayyar means Brahmin. So he himself was a Brahmin. He writes a book on a temple where he doesn't talk about Brahmin male power, exclusionary tendencies, all that he romanticizes. Is a top post-colonial theorist and global theorist now, deeply problematic. I find him as a benign Brahmin. So there are some, like Foucault says, systematic blindnesses of all these folks, Gajendran Ayyathurai and all of them. So this is the temple that I found out in my recent study trip. Sexual posture right in the middle. I'm sorry. Yeah, Bronco. Oh, I missed that. Oh, boy. Sorry. Coordination. Sorry. So brick wall of energy, yeah. And then here, Western postcolonial, right? And then here you go. This is a sexual posture that I found near the Sanctum Sanctorum. This kind of sexual posture near a deity in a South Indian temple, not in Khajuraho in the North Indian temple, right in South India where I visited. And this is one. And then, this is another. Clearly, imagine this. This was done centuries ago next to the deity. Should I engage with this image or not? This is also part of the temple. Why has this sculptor done something that is defying the state and the religious authority and so on? This is part of Tamil South Indian temple. Anyway, so so there is this silencing of the subaltern I see in Gayatri Spivak's work. We can speak. There are clearly, I see in the text, she romanticizes learned Brahmins. I mean, there's oxymoron. You can't be a learned person at the same time a Brahmin. Like I said, Brahmin is exclusionary. If I'm learned, I have to give up my caste identity, right? How can you say you are a learned Brahmin? So Spivak herself is a Brahmin, and therefore she can romanticize. So I have many things we can talk about it. So that work is terrible work. And for this reason, we need to provincialize, I say, provincialize Western post-colonial Brahminism, provincializing Europe. Deepesh Chakravarti says, but should we provincialize Brahminism or not? I think we should. So therefore, this British Raj, I'll skip this. Critical caste feminism from South India emerged from this person I worked on this person for my PhD, Ayyathurai. He was a Buddhist. So he lived between 1845 and 1914. And then, there he was a Buddhist, and he called himself casteless, an anti-caste, and a casteless Buddhist. And he was not a ritual Buddhist. So, and then he published a journal called The Tamilian from 1907 to 1914. Imagine, more than 100 years ago. The journal is called The Tamilian. So in that, he had a ladies column that was published from 1907. I had goosebumps when I read this. Ladies column in 1907 from Tamil language. Imagine. And they were talking about caste and gender inseparably. I really had goosebumps. I'm sitting at Columbia and reading this. So, and there this lady was, Swapneswari Ambal. She called herself, universal sister. In Tamil, Sarvajana Sagodari. It means universal sister. So she came up with this, and she was questioning. And here is a massive quote. I'll just condense it. She talks about sexuality here. Critical feminism, and Ayyathurai, Swapneswari Ambal. And here you go, her quote on sexuality. She talks about child marriage, where it says, 15-year-old girl or less are prone to widowhood. Do you think she will keep quiet? She will fall in love. She will have sex. She will have a baby. Because you are not allowing her to get married, she will kill the baby and find another lover. When was this written? 1913. As I mentioned here, November 19th, 1913. A lady writing about her body, her sexual interest, her sexuality, and for the other girls. This was really powerful. That's where I'm winding it up in 2 minutes, Barbara, sorry. So Swapnism was sexuality. And this is where I've narrowed down to something called, after all this reading, organic intellectuals and their voices. Organic intellectuals and their voices. I'm conceptualizing something like critical caste. That means what? Caste is a problem. I know there were others who were raising this question, about music. Music in India is embedded in caste. Uma Chakravarti, historian, was visiting Germany before COVID. I asked her, is there a possibility of Bharatanatyam or Carnatic music or Hindustani music to be inclusive? She said, no. It is Brahminical, and there is no scope for it in all these dance forms and music. What was my thought? I also agree. These traditions are embedded in castes unless they address Brahmin male power and the caste power. They are not going to be inclusive. I talk about this in critical caste studies, and how you need to, on the one hand, two things. One, you have to dislodge, deconstruct, remove Brahminism and the Brahmin male power. At the same time, reconstruct, rework, reinvent, find the resources of the oppressed and the marginalized from interior India, from different vernacular traditions. We need to bring them back to the center. I mean, this is the core project of critical studies. When we send students, please make sure, and those of you who work on South Asia, don't recruit any more Brahmin students. Enough. We need to get 95% back here. And when you send your students, German students, to work, please make sure, this person goes back and works and contributes for the transformation back there. This is said in the US, I'm saying it in Europe. Otherwise, we all want untouchables to be untouchables there so that we all can do projects and publish books and everything will be fine. Romanticize India as a Hindu, good Brahmin country. That's not the case. I stop here. Thanks. Vielen Dank. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gajendran. Yep. And now, without much delay, hopefully, we go on to Rhoda Reddock, who should be with us. She's there. So
the name has to be changed.
Okay. So in the meantime, I can probably already introduce her.
Yes, I am here.
Yeah, you are. Good morning, I should say.
Good morning. Yes, good morning.
Excuse the delay. We are already in the afternoon, but we had so many interesting discussions that there is some delay. So briefly, without further letting you wait, I just present you to the audience or to those who do not know you. Rhoda Reddock was a deputy principal of the University of West Indies. She already before that, and I think this is important for our panel, was the head of the Center of Gender and Development Studies. She's also been a visiting professor at several universities, including Florida International University, and also a consultant for a number of international agencies, including United Nations Development Fund for Women and the United Nations Development Program. So her main areas of interest, as you can see, are women's labor, gender and history, but also intersectionality of race, class and gender, the topic of our panel. So Rhoda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And these are indeed rich presentations, and I hope that we will be able to get copies of them. I need to share my screen, so I hope I have the capacity to do this. Okay, thanks very much. So my topic, Sociology, Feminisms, and the Global South, Back to the Future. And I want to say that there are echoes in my presentation in much of what has gone before. In this presentation, I examine the colonial and the post-colonial and gender development of sociologies in the Global South and ask the question, what of the feminist sociological knowledge created in the South by scholars of the South is a truly global and feminist future for sociology possible? And what role for scholars in the North and the South in this regard? I do this by examining two locations in the Global South and the South in the North. Now, we're all aware of the work of Gominda Bambra and others. In 2007, she argued that unlike anthropology and literary theory, there was a missing revolution in sociology. She referred to it as a post-colonial revolution, but perhaps I may prefer to refer to it as a decolonial revolution in sociology. Central to her argument was the view that the way in which we understand the past has implications for the social theories we develop to deal with situations we live in today. Hence the need to understand modernity as the outcome of connected histories. And I think this is one of the important components of decolonial theory, the recognition that in a way, colonialism links the North to the South in very specific ways, and the legacies of colonialism in a way also exist in the North, and the need to really recognize this so that the colonial project therefore is not only in the South, but also in the North. Mignolo, in his discussion, highlights the critiques of coloniality that already began in the South. So I think it's important that today's decolonial and post-colonial theory must recognize the legacy in the South that already existed for many decades and even beyond. He highlights, for example, the critiques of coloniality coming from the South, for example, in the work of Fanon, who was influenced by the earlier work of his teacher, Aimé Césaire, and of course, there are numerous others, as well as the contribution of the Latin American dependency thinkers and the New World Group in the Caribbean. And many of these critiques, of course, draw on the work of Southern Global South scholars, some located in the North, some still in the South, like Anibal Quijano, Hotunji, and of course, Caribbean, Jamaican Sylvia Wynter. And Quijano's notion of the coloniality of power has been central to this critique as it integrates sociology within a nexus of hegemonic Euro-American global power constructed through the creation of unequal racial categories of superiority and inferiority and consolidated through the processes of colonialism and capitalism. Similarly, in some of my own work, I have shown clearly how colonial ethno-racial categories become cemented into racialized census categories, and today to identities that become the basis of modern socioeconomic and political structures and systems. So Sylvia Wynter identifies the overarching power of Western bourgeois conceptualizations of the human, which she refers to as man, and its coloniality of being, power, truth, and freedom, arguing further that this coloniality of power cannot be dislodged without the redescription of the human outside the terms of our present circumscribed understandings of humanness. And I think that the presentation before this really echoes this. Now, of course, there are also the contributions for the epistemology of the South, coming from Santos Alatas, who's present here, notion of academic dependence on the North for various levels of social scientific activity. Hotunji notes the resource constraints facing Southern institutions and the migrations of some of the best scholars to the North. And in addition, the scholarly agenda of the South is shaped methodologically and epistemologically by discourses and approaches of the North. And I have found it intriguing also how book titles and article titles published in the global North seldom cite a location. In other words, when they speak of a particular phenomena, it's assumed to have universal significance, whereas those of us located in the South tend to be a bit more humble and sometimes locate the site of our research and data collection. But in this way, acknowledging that it is based on a location, even though it can still have global relevance. So this leads us to the other point, which is the applicability of research carried out in other parts of the world by local scholars, which is presumed to be limited to those of limited relevance to those countries only, and not at a larger global scale. Now, drawing on Lugones' conceptualization of the coloniality of gender, in this presentation, I examine the hierarchy of knowledge production and valuation in relation to feminist knowledge and the hierarchical systems and circuits of knowledge around which they're constructed and ranked. Raewyn Cornell, in her article in Critical Sociology in relation to this, notes that sociology as a discipline has been positively impacted by gender analysis. But in her discussion, she refers to a rich scholarship of Northern-based third world women. In so doing, she is unable to incorporate the strong and vibrant feminist scholarship that is not located in the North or essentially within the framework of Western sociology. Both Hotunji and Cornell, as I noted before, highlight the resource constraints within which many Southern scholars operate, a powerful reason why so many migrate and move to locations in the Northern metropoles. In my region, for example, an average of 80% of tertiary educated graduates migrate to the global North. And this was highlighted by Amina Mama in her editorial for the launch of the first issue of the journal Feminist Africa in 2002, where she observed, at present, an estimated 100,000 African academics are located in the North. Ironically, the same number of expatriate experts is imported to advise African governments each year at annual cost of $4 billion to foreign exchange reserves. What could this vast expense spent differently have contributed to retaining or returning desperately needed African faculty, some of whom might have provided sounder advice than all those expatriate experts? So my next section looks at feminist theory and the global South. I begin with the organization, Association of African Women for Research and Development, AWARD, AFAD in French, which as early as 1977 justifies its formation as follows, describes its formation as follows: a continental organization created in December 1977 in Dakar by African researchers and activists driven by their desire to decolonize African research of Western subjective analysis. So already this decolonial critique predated our current discussions that did not reflect the realities and conditions of the engagement of women in the continent's development process. For many years in that organization, in an effort to strengthen local scholars and activists, full membership was limited to scholars resident on the continent to ensure that continental voices were not overshadowed. In 1999, the Network Gender and Women's Studies in Africa, GWS Africa, was established at the African Gender Institute of the University of Cape Town, comprising a new generation of African feminist scholars located in the North and the South. And in contrast with AWARD, AFAD, the concerns were less with the North and more with the patriarchal hegemony of African universities and the need to provide an empowering space for strengthening African feminist theory and scholarship and its impact on the mainstream disciplines. And I quote from Mama again, African feminists have begun to imagine and build a community that brings activist and intellectual work together to advance social transformations, both within and beyond the academy, and to push the disciplinary frontiers of social theory and develop continental feminist intellectual work. Coming out, one of the first projects of GWS Africa and the African Gender Institute was the development of the journal Feminist Africa. And this was important as it claimed feminism for Africans and challenged the view by many that feminism was un-African or non-African. And this journal now is in at least its 15 years and has now shifted from the African Gender Institute to the University of Ghana, Legon. So in volume one, it noted, Feminist Africa responds to the heightened salience of gender in African political and intellectual landscapes. It provides a forum for the intellectual activism that has been intrinsic to feminism the world over. It provides the first continental platform for reflecting on the feminist wisdom that has matured in the cauldron of post-colonial gender contradictions. Now, in 1991, the collection, The Third World Woman and the Politics of Feminism, was published in the United States. They identified third world women in the North as an imagined community, a socio-political designation for people of African, Caribbean, Asian, and Latin American descent and Native peoples in the US, including new immigrants to the US in the last decade, Arab, Korean, Thai, Laotian, etc., and seen as coterminous with women of color. Now, this identification, this imagined community, was constructed in opposition to what they defined as Western feminism, characterized by assumptions of privilege and ethnocentric universality and inadequate self-consciousness about the effect of Western scholarship on the third world in the context of a world system dominated by the West. Now, what was missing from these discussions was the voice of third world women still located in the global South. and the acknowledgement of the privileged access to financial and intellectual resources of those in the North, although still limited in comparison with their counterparts. What is also important is that one's physical or geographic location does impact the direction and content on one's scholarship. For example, a particular politics of race and ethnicity has become necessary in the North, which despite overarching global hegemonies, plays out differently in various locations of the South. So in other words, what I'm arguing is that for scholars located in the North, they are engaged in a specific struggle with global racism or racial capitalism, which although it exists globally, may take different forms in different locations. So for example, in conceptualizing my own work in the article, Conceptualizing Difference in Caribbean Feminist Theory, I explore the different ways in which issues of race, ethnicity, class, and gender, what we would now refer to as intersectionality, emerge in post-colonial multi-ethnic societies such as my own, Trinidad and Tobago, where the main axes of class and ethnic contestation are not between white women and their others, but among women and people of color themselves in a context structured by race, color, and ethnic inequalities, stereotypes, and categories, which were defined within European colonialism and maintained as part of its legacies. Now, in India, these three scholars are Pukaskai, Asta, Subramanian, Desai, and Bose, four scholars of Indian heritage located in US universities, provide a useful review of one section of Native feminist and gender scholarship in India. They focus primarily on scholars who are natives or primarily based in India and who have written first for Indian audiences. This is very important. We include work that would not be considered academic in the United States. However, our collective experience suggests that these non-academic publications are important sites in which gender has been conceptualized. They argue that the role of the public intellectual remains much more vibrant in India than it is in the United States. Thus, academic debates and controversies are expressed in multiple platforms. They highlight some important aspects of Indian gender scholarship that would be useful to the United States. For example, like GWS Africa, they highlight the work of activist scholars who combine activism in rural and urban spaces with scholarship. The critiques of the impact of colonialism, neocolonialism, and the current phase of neoliberalism have been important components of Indian gender scholarship. The ongoing conversation between movement scholarship and the university-based scholarship in India results in a movement-driven analysis, which is able to address caste, poverty, deserted women, for example, widows, as mentioned before, in a different ways. They also note areas of common global interest, of course, violence against women, the rise of fundamentalist movements, which India and other places in the global South have had to deal with much earlier than in the North. Ecofeminism, of course, which Indian scholars have also dealt with in in-depth ways, as well as issues of citizenship and multiculturalism, decades before this began to frame debates in the United States. Now, these US-based scholars conclude that many of the issues addressed by Indian scholars, are similar to those in other parts of the world. However, this work often does receive global attention. And it is clear, therefore, in the same way as we all draw from the work of Kimberly Kelshaw on intersectionality in our work throughout the world, that the work of Indian feminist scholars of all traditions we may also draw on their work in our own local scholarship and interventions. So in this presentation, therefore, I have argued that scholarship based on locations in the South are globally valid and can make important contributions to teaching, research frameworks, and analysis. I also call for a truly global feminist scholarship that engages with, that is, reads, debates, teaches, and incorporates scholarship from the global South as part of its normal activities. I also call for a scholarship where the academic stars don't all come from the US, UK, or France. And this includes as well, although to a lesser extent, academic stars from among the global South scholars working and living in the North. For those of us located in the South, it is always necessary to know, to interrogate, and to critically use Northern scholarship. And of course, we teach it, we cite it, we quote it. But alongside our local and regional scholarship, in a way to have a kind of double consciousness as identified by W.E.B. Du Bois so many years ago in Souls of Black Folk. But we too need to engage more with the South in a kind of South-South collaboration. And we also recommend this to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rhoda, also for keeping the time. And so we pass now on to our third presentation, and afterwards we have some time for discussion. So now we go on to Encarnacion Rodriguez, no, Gutiérrez Rodriguez. Encarnacion is there? Yeah. So while she's coming to the screen, I present her. Encarnacion holds a chair in sociology, it's becoming late, in the Institute of Sociology at the Justus Liebig University in Germany. But at the moment, she is a visiting professor at the University of Alberta in Canada. So this is why she cannot be with us. And she's also a visiting professor at the University in Port Elizabeth in South Africa. She's also been teaching in other countries like in Quito at the University of Ecuador. Her recent publications are Decolonial Perspective on Entangled Inequalities, Europe and the Caribbean. So here she has co-worked with Rhoda Reddock. And also I just mentioned one more title, Entangled Migrations, the Coloniality of Migration and Creolizing Conviviality. Good morning, Encarnacion. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Hi, everyone.
Yes.
Okay, great. It's a bit confusing. So thank you to Barbara for moderating and organizing, and also to Claudio Pinheiro and Sina Close, and all other organizers of this conference. I'll join you in person. But it's great to be here in the panel and also to be with the colleagues and especially with Rhoda. Here's our book that we just published together. And the paper I was planning to present is in this book on care and domestic work, but I decided to shift the focus by really looking at higher education, which is also another work I do, especially from a decolonial critical university studies angle. So I was also very inspired by Claudio Pinheiro's yesterday introductory remarks, and also looking at geographies of global inequality, especially geographies of economy, by thinking through the idea or the notion of the South, and I would say also the entanglement between South and North. So I'm interested also in how the higher education institutions, particularly the university, becomes a site of what has been described in research of academic capitalism. I would look at that in my paper, and I would look also at gender studies in universities and the role of gender studies, and then also at international students recruitment and the context of institutional racism in this context, also related to migration policies. First to start, I think it's important to see that when we think from a decolonial, queer, trans, feminist, crip perspective and methodology, this is a site at the university that is very minoritized and very difficult to move along those paths. Sarah Ahmed has mentioned in this context that it's a killing, joy killing, in a way, to be this kind, position yourself in this situation, in this context. So, but going back to the topic I'm interested to exchange with you today, I think one important aspect when we look at academic capitalism and the development of universities to corporates is one paper published in 1994 by the World Bank, where it was suggested that education could be a site of capital production and accumulation. This paper was also proposing to introduce tuition fees, so fees for students. And already some private universities in the United States and in other parts of the world, but especially the United States, were already walking this path and were very much engaging with it. And what was interesting also is the kind of impact that it had on British universities, which are state-run universities. They started to introduce tuition fees, and which at the moment are astronomical and also channel the access to higher education for certain groups. Another aspect that is important for this kind of marketization of education is the ambitions of internationalizing the field, which within this kind of global economy context, it has meant for a lot of universities to think about international students as potential assets, as potential for internationalization, but also within an economic notion of recruitment. At the same time, also a kind of recruitment of international staff has happened, more pronounced, that also is very much within the context of, of taking part also in the kind of global ranking happening, and also in this kind of process of commodification. So important in a way in this process is the kind of transformation of education to a profit-oriented issue, item, or we could say also commodity. So within this context, a lot, as I already mentioned, mobility is playing a role, and especially migration is playing a role. So not only the migration of, and you already mentioned it, from students from the global south to the north, but also from staff. And at the same time, we are encountering in Europe, but also in Northern America, so Canada and the United States, an increasing restriction of migration policies, curtailing the access to those countries. And this is also impacting on the level of international students and staff. So in a way, what I would like to discuss today with you is the impact of migration control policies on racialized and minoritized international students and academics. I put Britain, but I will concentrate on Germany as we don't have time to go both, to look at both. So ignore the UK part. So the outline, in a way, it's about the neoliberal university and the role that inclusion and diversity plays in it. The university as a site of hegemonic whiteness, reproduction, migration policies, and institutional discrimination. And if we still have time, I would like to talk about affective economies and the feeling of dispossession that occurs within this kind of context. So let's start with the neoliberal university, inclusion and diversity. Research addressing the marketization of education, and in particular the commodification of secondary and tertiary education, has drawn attention to the development of academic capitalism. Focusing on the impact of this development, research in this field has focused on questions of curricula, the implementation, the implementation of neoliberal policies, the interplay between market and education, the institutional impact of audit culture, and the production of neoliberal academic subjectivities. The analysis of academic capitalism addresses the development of education to market-driven learning formats, audit culture, and branding. Further, the orientation towards international league table rankings, in which the parameters of research quality and institutional reputation are largely set by leading US and UK universities, indirectly impose a standardized model of measuring research quality through income, output, and impact. These institutions are characterized by selective admission practices and high fees, very few students funding, an international faculty and student body, a considerable volume of research venue, and significant publication outputs in international high impact journals. And you all already mentioned, and it has been a discussion, they're mostly based in the Northern context. Further, these institutions champion the establishment of elite professional schools, as well as make high investment in science and technology. Occupying the first 100 positions in the global league tables, these institutions serve as a benchmarks for universities competing in the global market in higher education. In Britain, for example, positions in league tables inform state funding decisions, leading in some cases to severe cuts in areas classified as less financially sustainable. This particularly affects disciplines in arts and humanities, and to some extent, the more exploratory ethnographic and qualitative social sciences. Though this research has deepened our understanding of the entanglement between education, politics, and markets, little consideration has been given in this literature to how gendered, racialized inequalities are reshuffled within the neoliberal university. The incorporation of diversity policies into the neoliberal university's management agenda, for example, has promoted to some extent the creation of gender studies programs, mostly based on a precarious infrastructure. Women gender studies and gender studies teaching delivery is often organized by faculty employed in other disciplines, and an increasing group of temporary workers or precarious workers composed mainly of a female racialized local and international body of adjunct and temporary lecturers and researchers held on the lowest pay grade. The location of women gender studies programs in the neoliberal university reveals an ambivalent positioning that reflects also the management of diversity as an income resource. If they contribute to university revenue streams, they might be considered an area for investment. What is interesting in this regard is the focus on gender in these programs. Nevertheless, the establishment of these programs still represent a field of political struggle, as the anti-feminist attacks on women gender studies programs in Scandinavia and Germany, and also in Hungary, for example, have this demonstrated in the recent years. Thus, the institutional consolidation of gender studies programs is subjected to political conjunctures and needs to be discussed in a broader social context. As institutions marked by social inequalities, universities are not only marked by class and gender, but also by national white male and also female elites. Further, the neoliberal university is shaped also by migration control policies. In recent years, debates regarding the neoliberal university have turned attention to institutional racism in academia. While the perspective on institutional racism might have some shortcomings in understanding the cultural predication, everyday dimension of racism, it sharpens our view on institutional practices of discrimination and social exclusion. As Mike Cole notes, the analysis of institutional racism is not only interested in the mere structural dimension of racism, but it particularly highlights the intersections between everyday and institutional practices. The analysis of institutional racism in universities raises questions in regard to mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion. These mechanisms operate on the basis of a power matrix that I define with Aníbal Quijano's coloniality of power, deriving from a colonial pattern of thinking, producing social hierarchies through racialization. Since colonial times, these patterns of racialization has been altered through specific historical regional contingencies. The racial stratification of society is not explicitly imposed by an administration or jurisdiction in contemporary societies. However, it is recreated through subtle institutional practices favoring the access of the white national affluent population to leadership position, as well as political and cultural representations. Further, as we will see in regard to the implementation of migration control policies in universities, while not explicitly operating within a racial matrix, the logic of hierarchical differentiation that they establish reproduces social hierarchies, reflecting and reinforcing processes of racialization. Aside guaranteeing the institutionalization of knowledge production, universities are strategic loci for the establishment of cultural hegemony. As I have discussed elsewhere in reference to Bourdieu, Homo academicus, universities reflect deeply entrenched social inequalities marked by class, race, disability, and migration. Thus, universities reflect the inherent social inequalities within the nation state. When it comes to German state universities, what becomes apparent in the gender, class, and racial stratification of these institutions is that there are also sites of mainly white national affluent groups' reproduction. Therefore, the analysis of the restructuring of the university cannot just be confined to an economic question. Rather, the negotiations around public spending cuts and austerity measures reveal also an ideological dimension. Behind the restructuring of the neoliberal university may lie political interests related to ideological projects. It is in this regard that discussions on gender and diversity deserve some attention. When we look at diversity, diversity has been at the center of managerial strategies in British university for some time and is increasingly being included in the strategic development plans of German universities. In the British context, the principle of diversity prescribes an institutional goal. What this allows often is a token representation of minority groups and also some women. Nonetheless, the limited inclusion of women and national minorities into leading management and research positions precludes the fact that structurally very little has changed in the feminized and racial division of work in universities. While in the last decade, gender equality measures in German universities have resulted in a moderate increase in female professors, they tend to be white and belong to the national elite or middle class. Members of racialized groups, people of colors, or also post-migrant groups are still represented at the margin. Despite an increase in international Black, people of color, and post-migrant professors in German universities in the last decade, the interpretation of this development as indicative of increased social mobility and inclusion of Black and POC scholars needs further examination. By concentrating on international and post-migrant teaching and research staff, the methodological framework shows, for example, that those scholars are mainly not related to areas of study or critical studies that might also interrogate the university as a system. While the neoliberal university embraces diversity and gender equality, creating the impression that race, nationality, and gender do not represent any obstacles in recruitment and promotion decisions, the structurally ingrained feminized and racialized division of work remains unchallenged. Such a division of work, as we will see, is reinforced through migration control policies. This is particularly evident when national migration control policies enter university campuses. Racism and migration controls policies do not stop at the gates of universities. As nation-state institutions, universities are regulated by migration policies. As such, they are not exempt from the logic of exclusion embedded in migration control and management devices, permanently reproducing nations other as racialized, ethnicized, and culturally different. When migration policies enter the gates of the neoliberal university, the national racial matrix underlying the nation-state's governance logic and practice becomes tangible. While not explicitly operating within a racial matrix, migrations policy are reminiscent of a colonial pattern of thinking, producing social hierarchies through racialization. International students and academics, as well as non-academic staff, are subjected to visa and migration control regulations. Considering that international students are not a homogeneous unit, but rather composed by heterogeneous cultural, economic, geographical, political, and social differences, the impact of migration policies varies in regard to nationality and economic position. In the study conducted by Lee and Rice on racial discrimination of international students in the United States, the authors reveal that students from the Middle Africa, East and South Asia and Latin America experience forms of discrimination that Lee terms neo-racism. In reference to this study, Lee seeks to capture with this term the institutional discriminatory mechanisms resulting from political regulations. Resonating with the already discussed term of institutional racism, Lee's analysis of neo-racism differentiates between direct and indirect forms of racial discrimination. Direct forms of discrimination are, so Lee, I cite, detention without limit, denial of due process, and violations of personal freedoms of some individuals, cumbersome foreign students tracking, new hurdles for obtaining visa to enter the United States, and fingerprinting and profiling procedures in the name of maintaining national security. On an indirect level, discrimination occurs through unequal treatment. For example, and I cite, in the form of less than objective academic evaluation, loss of employment or an inability to obtain a job, difficulty in forming interpersonal relationships with instructors, advisors, and peers, negative stereotypes and inaccurate portrayals of one culture's negative comments about foreign accent. Both levels, as we will see in the discussion, and I don't think we have time, but we can do it later in the discussion, both levels also have an impact on the affective dynamics that they experience. In the European context, migration, surveillance, and control technologies in the universities are not only articulated by political regulations, policies, and measures, but in particularly by everyday practices and imaginaries. It is on these two levels that institutional racism is experienced. Operating on the distinction between citizen and migrant, migration policies produce different legal categories of inclusion and exclusion to citizenship rights. Questions of settlement, political participation, family reunification, freedom of movement, access to the labor market, to education, to health insurance, and social benefits are regulated on this basis. Legal migratory status is indicative of the opportunities or hindrances individuals or collectives legally marked as migrants, refugees, or asylum seekers encounter. For example, undocumented migrants, refugees without leave to remain, and asylum seekers do not have access to higher education. Though they might individually fulfill the official prerequisites for acceptance as students, the legal status keeps them in a space of social inertia, preventing them from participating in work and or study. In the case of international students and scholars, we are already dealing with a group of migrants who due to the financial means or professional skills, have been able to receive temporary residency status in Europe. Yet, as I will discuss, despite their privileged position in regard to the legal status, this group is not exempt from the discriminatory assault.
Encarnación, excuse, you should come to an end.
I'm coming to an end. My last part, produced through anti-migration rhetoric and migration control policies. Germany has also introduced a specific residency title for international students. In order to enter the country, international students apply for an initial student visa in order to be able to apply for the study residency title, officially authorizing the students to pursue the program of studies. So in some, German migration control policies have detrimental effects on international students. Only international students that do not face any financial hardships are able to study to show that they have sufficient monthly income and are only allowed to work minimally. And with this in mind, I just close it and just like to add this perspective into our discussion. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you, Encarnación, for this presentation. And now we can start the discussion. We have until latest 6 o'clock. So who wants to start? Yeah, Sergio.
Yeah, thank you so much, you three, for these really fascinating talks. I have a question for Gajendran, and it has to do fascinating, and I'm also quite convinced from your perspective, but I like to make perhaps more complicated for you to in order to be even more convincing on this, because as you described, the power of Brahmins, so it's a sort of, if you read that the literature on social class, they work like social class. So they're creating social closure for other groups in order to keep the power, economic power, and also political power. Mm-hmm. So therefore, if they work like social class, mm-hmm. You also address the topic gender and also religion. Mm-hmm. My question to you is is really possible to have something like, as you propose, critical caste studies, if at the end, intersectionality is at the core there. So how to concentrate only on caste, if caste is, as you describe it, not to separate from other axes of inequality. And then for Professor Rhoda Reddock, I'd like just to ask you for continue. This is a very, very inspiring figure, which with you ended our presentation, this idea of double consciousness. So we know, of course, this from Du Bois. So as a way to engage at the national level with citizenship rights, but knowing that citizenship rights have limits for actually cover Blacks because of the history and also the contemporaneity of racism and so on. What would be exactly the double consciousness in case of scholars from the Global South? Is to engage with the North and also with locals or South-South cooperation? This is what was not clear for me. What are the, so to say, the both poles of this double consciousness?
Thank you, Sergio. Is there another question we might collect for a moment? Yes.
Yep.
Just a comment. I really liked your concept of malignant Brahminism, because I caution you not to use it in India, because you might get lynched.
I was almost going to die. I'm still, and I have a threat. I'll talk about that.
Yes.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
And the thing about caste is that you can never escape it or exit it.
Yes.
Class you can exit or escape, but caste is your destiny in a way.
Yeah, I have a question for the three of you, because when we discuss gender, there is, of course, a background of feminist theory and how the feminist theory could allow us to start to work, not just to think, but start to work in a more ethical knowledge production. And I was talking this morning about the mode of production of science in the Global South and the huge differences about that. We were discussing about that over lunch, and how it's almost impossible to do certain things because of this particular need that in most places in the Global South, we need to produce, and the labor of the scholars support the university. And then we have, because this is a North-South conference, the big elephant in the room, that is, of course, when there is North-South collaboration, the money never comes from the South. We have resources, human resources, intellectual resources, goodwill, flexibility to travel, etc., but no money. And it's very hard to think in an ethical science when we have very little voice of how money is spent, in particular in collaborative research. I mean, we are the recipients. We don't have any voice in how this money is, because of course it's not taxpayers' money, of course, but still, this is for me one of the major things to do, because we have discussed, you know, Global South tensions in terms of theory and in terms of methodology, but when it comes to the actual production of science, this is not a minor issue. So my question is completely open, and I will really, really like to hear from you three about that.
Yeah, I think that's enough for a first round of answers.
Yeah.
So maybe you start, and then our colleagues online.
Are you able to hear me? Good. Sergio, thank you for that question. And I apologize for missing that word, intersectionality. In fact, I'm beginning to write a paper on what I call transnational intersectionalities, plural. Sister Kimberly Crenshaw used the word singular sectionality. But I do field work in the Caribbean. I published a paper on what I call immigration against caste. how people using the indentured policy, which came into being in 1834, to replace slavery in plantation colonies. So Indians, more than 2 million of them were taken over to different parts of the world. So I am doing fieldwork with them to understand whether this, as sister said, this damn thing called caste be shed, at least outside India. So, and thankfully I'm reinforced it could be. So I wrote a paper called Immigration of Castes in the journal called Essays in Philosophy. It's available free online, please. So there I talk about, and I want to build on intersectionality. So I definitely connect how in the Caribbean race and caste they get intersected. Class is definitely part of it. The privileged groups, the richer class, they claim the identities. Upper caste identity, Brahmin identity in the Caribbean. 2 generations ago, they don't even know their caste background. The great-granddad would have been a Muslim. The great-granddad would have been, most of them were lower caste and untouchables, because the job was to do sugarcane cultivation, not to run a temple, right? And many of them died while they were in a voyage. So Muslims mixed with, so-called Hindus or other groups. And so all these things happen. So I find transnational intersectionality as a productive conceptual tool to understand their intersecting aspects. So thank you. I'm sorry. I apologize for having missed it out in my presentation. Sister, thank you for saying about malignant Brahminism under threat. I don't know whether you heard about it. On September 10th, 11th, and 12th, we had a conference called Dismantling Global Hindutva. 70 universities from the US, Europe, Harvard, Columbia, all of them got together. Hindutva means a way of Hindu life. It's a malignant, violent concept that has come into being. Now, right now we have Hindu rightist government in India. So to oppose this, scholars who have different ideas got together, organized the movement. A conference, 3-day conference. And I was invited to speak based on my work. I was invited to speak on caste and Hindutva. And I agreed. My topic was systematic blindnesses, Hindutva, caste, and the brick wall of caste and Hindu identity. That's the topic. Once the list was out, we were all prone to death threats. Some of my friends withdrew. I spoke to my wife. Sorry, they said, why are you putting us into trouble? Okay, so many of my friends, there were 1 million emails were bombarded for my friends across the country. Some of our university systems collapsed. Göttingen University received 6,000 emails, hate mails. So thankfully, the university did not, give up on us, and they backed us up. So I'm still under a threat. But I told my wife and child, this is the time for me. I have to call a spade a spade. Yes, there might be a threat. It might be for you too, but we need to do it so that our next generation doesn't get affected. How long can we go on chicken out, from this? So it is true. But I want to, and then please understand, this is not meant to, what do we do with the Brahmin groups? Do I want them to put in a concentration camp? No. So there is a connection between the oppressor giving up the castehood as well as the oppressed coming together. So can we establish a casteless community is a struggle that we are all into, right? So in critical caste studies, you need to interrogate caste. Caste is not good. So we were never taught as a student, undergrad student, postgraduate student, you as an Indian, we have never been taught by a professor, hey guys, caste is a problem, like racism. We all have to become casteless. No one professor had the spine to speak to us. And I begin to do that. So, and it will be the threat, we have to do it. So thank you for reinforcing my thinking, I appreciate. But I am also very alert to this benign, condescending casteism that I may put on you, you see. So it's not just openly violent one, but also this benign one we should be aware of. That's where I'm heading. And then the money part, the third question was, I'm sorry. So the money, I agree. But there is an exception. I lived for more than 12 or 13 years in the US and went through Ivy League and all that. There is a phenomenon that is happening. There are multi-billionaires, Indian upper caste families in the US. They are pumping money, both into India as well as in the US and in Europe, establishing chairs, particularly Sanskrit chairs, anthropology chairs. Hindu studies is basically sugarcoating Brahminism. Okay, and they pump in millions and they're recruiting students. So let's be aware. Let's be aware of this. And thankfully, Germany is restraining now a little bit. Hopefully, they can hold on to. Scotland and England, they're trying, but the US is sold off. So the privileged Indians are controlling universities. And I didn't want to work on organic intellectuals in India with an Indian professor I did not trust. I went to Colombia and I was in a shock because I was the only sort of anti-caste guy there. Literally, many of them were Marxists and so on, sugarcoating Brahminism. I regretted why I went to Colombia, to be honest. So that is our next project is write a paper on Ivy League. Who has been the professor? Who are the people they have recruited? I want to do. And I know Brahmins have recruited only Brahmin students. Sorry, apologies for taking time. I stop here.
I think this is an important issue. So thank you. Now, who wants to start? Rhoda is still looking at her paper. So maybe Encarnacion, you can start.
No, Rhoda, would you like to go ahead? No? Because one question was towards Rhoda too. So I got the third question and the role of feminist theory in transforming our thinking and our practices. I think it's not just a heterogeneous field, and what I encounter is that there's some kind of feminist theory that has become part of the canon, and some other feminist theory, and I think both papers from Rhoda and also from Gajendran Ayyathurai have spoken about the organic intellectuals, the form of collective protest and struggle that happens. I just published in Germany a book on migrant feminism with my colleague Bina Tuscu, which is about the 1980s, 1990s anti-racist migrant of feminists. And those, for example, are not part of the canon. So, and when you do decolonial, queer, trans, crip feminism, we are still speaking about an area that is perceived as activism, but not a theory production. Also, when we are discussing postcolonial or decolonial perspective in social theory, and what we see, or the question we need to raise is, how do these different forms of analyzing society that try to understand also relationships of power, relationships of inclusion, how vocabularies like diversity, all the establishment of gender studies programs with a lot of hope that we transform something, very often become part, even the post-colonial or the decolonial can become part of a kind of a hegemonic project. And I think it's very important, one, to discuss what you're also mentioning in your question, how economy works in there, how capital circulates, and how capital becomes a goal of reproduction, and what role do we play in it. And of course, the kind of distribution of this capital, but also how our theory might reproduce though you're doing decolonial social theory, you might be doing heteronormativity again. And what does it mean? I mean, does it mean that we still think that talking about the heterosexual framing of our society it's something that just is private, it's not something that has a social structure? What does it mean that we don't have very many trans professors and trans Black or trans Indian professors in the academia? So I think these are still questions that are very important, like to talk about the commodification. It is great if some of us got the access to education. I'm a working class daughter of guest workers in Germany. Some of us has got this inclusion or are part of this academia, but still the structure is not moving in this way. If you still look at how the access to higher education is distributed in Germany, you will encounter that working class, migrant and racialized kids, and also German kids, are still quite in the outside of it. And so these are questions that we haven't solved just by introducing certain pits of feminism or decolonial or post-colonial theory. And of course, on the level of cooperation, there are other models, there are other ways of thinking, and it is an important, I know tomorrow there is anyway a discussion about that, a panel, to think about other ways of cooperating on a horizontal economic level. Thank you.
Okay, now it's your turn, Rhoda.
Yes, thanks a lot. Well, first of all, in relation to double consciousness, in my presentation, I was using it in a very specific sense, in that I was using it in relation to scholars' approach to knowledge, in that, you know, we have to know all the Northern work, all the Northern writers, authors, etc., in addition to our own local, regional, etc. And what I find is that in many instances, even in that, especially in the sciences, you know, that sometimes we don't even cite ourselves. I think in the social sciences, we do it much more, but in the physical and natural sciences, I had to tell my colleagues, you know, you don't even cite us, so what's the use? But then what I was saying is that even in the global South, and certainly where I am based, even though we have that double consciousness in relation to the North and our regions, South-South collaboration is something that I think that may have been stronger in the past, but certainly is not where it should be at this time. So what I was trying to say is that we need to strengthen that. But of course, most of the connections in terms of conferences, organizations, as my colleague mentioned about African studies, are North-South. So how do you create alternative and networks that are South-South? I think, and I think Sephis itself had have a history of that kind of work in its South-South exchange. And I think perhaps that may need to be revitalized and to go beyond simply an exchange. In relation to global production of knowledge, I think that's very important because, of course, you are always, especially those of us in the South, you know, in the past, in the Caribbean, sometimes it's even worse because in the past, it was easier for us to get funding directly from the North. But about 15 years ago, the funding had to come through a Northern organization, which made the dependency even greater. So that so we had to work through a Northern organization in order to get funds. So in other words, charting the direction, the vision was sometimes that we always had to negotiate around. I think in relation to funding in the Global South, the possibility of development funding was also something that existed prior to neoliberalism. Certainly in my part of the world, and a lot of our research could have been done with developmental funding, but then it meant that something had to be a problem. You know, the issue had to be defined as a developmental issue or a developmental problem, you know. For example, sexualities research. It was impossible for us to get research funds for sexualities research until HIV. HIV really opened up the possibility for sexualities research in the Caribbean and globally. But prior to that, it was not considered, sexuality issues were not considered a development priority. I also wanted to say that, of course, development funding was severely affected by neoliberalism because now the issue is not development, the issue is just primarily basically accumulating wealth. And so that is, I think Africa is probably the only place that still accesses development funding to some extent. And of course, I'm sure there are contradictions there as well. I was really interested to hear the talk about Indian migration, seeing that my country is one of those that had significant Indian migration, and also that this is an area where I have done quite a lot of work. And so I think the whole question of caste and what has happened to it in the diaspora is really important. Certainly in the Caribbean, I think just to correct you, there was Brahminical migration in two types. The first one was of Brahmins who hid their caste. The time of migration was a period of famine and dislocation and where people lost land, etc. So in fact, some Brahmins hid their caste in order to migrate and then reasserted it later. Of course, we also have the phenomena that we refer to locally as Brahmins by boat. That is people who, of course, assume Brahmin identity on arrival. But I think there was another category of Brahmins who came to the region, and those were Brahmin widows who saw migration as an effort, as a possibility of a new life in a situation where widowhood was extremely negative and debilitating. So I think that understanding Brahminism in the diaspora also calls for other kinds of issues. Personally, definitely there are Brahmin and caste values continue to exist, not necessarily in exactly the same way as India. But what is important, I have argued, and I'm working on this also in a book right now, is how caste values then shifted from only the Indian population to the wider population and govern things like ranking, like endogamy, new rules of endogamy and exogamy, new identifications of acceptance and non-acceptance, and also, of course, color reinforced in the already existing color hierarchies of British colonialism. So I think that, that there's a lot to unpack in terms of Brahminism in the diaspora, and perhaps we can have future discussions. Just to say that Hindutva, of course, so has really emerged in the context of global neoliberalism and the shift back to other kinds of identities, non-class into smaller identities. And of course that continues. And in fact, Hindutva has become a mechanism for Indian populations to struggle for greater identity, greater rights and recognition in these parts of the world. So that's a whole other discussion. Thank you. I don't know if I missed out anything else. No.
Well, thank you for the three of you. I don't see any more questions. Okay, one last question by Claudio, because then I think it's 6 o'clock and we should come to an end.
Yeah, okay. I just want to thank you for the splendid panel and the interventions and the talks that you three provided. Probably it's more like going along the lines what you said on the categories of diversity expressed through how gender, caste, class, or race is being used as, say, scientific commodities, explored not only as topics of investigation, but as ways of interfering within the balance of power at the global stage. And for that regard, there will be a continuation of this debate tomorrow, I suppose, on how foundations, what foundations can say about this in this regard, because in some aspects, the categories of diversity are being addressed by foundations, but only as far as this is understood as commodities. It doesn't sway. It doesn't sway until to inside the structure of academic, say, hiring in many places in the North. So it is fun as long as it's for a party, but not for marriage. So I suppose tomorrow the continuation will be interesting for that regard. But if you could say a word, just one word about that, if time allows, would be fantastic. Thank you so much.
Okay, a quick word and then.
Yes, sorry. I just wanted to mention, when you mentioned scientific commodities, the way in which the concept of caste is being used, for want of a better word, in North America in discussions about race. And I think that's very interesting. And of course, it has resurrected the work of a Trinidadian sociologist, Oliver Cromwell Cox. I don't know if you know of his work, who wrote, I believe it's 1946, the book Class, Caste, and Race, where he did a detailed examination of caste. Of course, today, that work would probably not be completely, you know, but I think that is an important way in how caste as a commodity now gets taken up continuously in other contexts to serve other kinds of purposes.
Encarnación, you want to?
I think
Yeah, you
And then I, yeah.
I think that diversity in a way within the Northern context, especially German universities, for example, you can see a competing between gender and diversity. So when it's gender, it's about white women, I would say, and diversity, and including queers, disability, and migrant and minoritized, racialized groups. It's a rhetoric formula, I would say, not even on the level of thinking when even after the whole debate around institutional racism and George Floyd would put racism on the agenda also. And so also institutions needed to have a response. Not even then racism was, for example, discussed in regard also how diversity is being also created through racialization, for example, or other forms of categorization. But within this context, for example, discussion could have taken place on having anti-discrimination officers, for example, for the experiences of being assaulted in regard to being racialized or in regard to being a sexual minority or so. And so we are far away of thinking more on a structural level and also on the level of having responses that also address the conflicts and also the vulnerabilities and violence that is happening.
Thank you. Now you have the last 2 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. Sister Rhoda, a fantastic understanding of caste, and I think you are clearly referring to interesting work on Guyana and elsewhere on Brahmin women who've been there, coolie woman work you are referring to, clearly. So I fully agree. In 1850s, Bengali Brahmin women escaped their families, as well as married women who said, my husband is torturing me. I want to escape to a place from where I don't want to return. So they took the ship to go to Caribbean. And this was out in the local media in 1850s, Calcutta. Now it's known as Kolkata. So you are absolutely right. I have details about that. And Gayutra Bahadur's book is Coolie Woman. She talks exactly about her own great-grandmother would have been one of those Brahmin widows who would have escaped. So you are absolutely right. And thank you for working on caste in the Caribbean. We all have to do. I'll share my materials and so that I can learn from you whether we can do something together on it. I appreciate. Also, this intersectionality of race and caste, the tensions in the Caribbean. What's happening, the pejorative understanding. By the way, Caribbean has the worst suicidal rate in the world, and it is with the Indian diaspora. Guyana tops the world, and that's because of this caste in a big way. So we need to address that. And it's not simply me doing field work there. I'm collaborating with brothers and sisters there with what could be done. Sexual violence from within the family is worse within the Indian communities in the Caribbean. We need to talk about that, right? And that's not the case. And the suicidal rate is not definitely less with the African descendants there. So we need to work on all that. So thank you. We'll do quickly for Claudio. Thank you for talking about this foundation. I don't know. I'm deeply. There are 45 South Asian studies in the US. If I'm, all of them are headed by Brahmins, and then once in a while they bring in a Muslims in a very condescending way and all that. So how long should it go on? The students they recruit, the money they spend, it's all the case. All is well, right? So the Hinduism, Sanskrit said that's how it goes. So we need to write to people like SSRC and many foundations, Ford and so on, to really question and who are they funding? Who are they recruiting? I am telling people in the US and Europe, when there is a job on South Asian studies, please do tell, write to the universities so that they can recruit somebody who has not been represented so far, right? So that has got to be done. And I'm getting into a project called Globalization of Caste in a big way to talk about this. And I clearly call what is called global Brahminism is in place right now. Should we interrogate or not? I think we should collectively. The oppressed from across the world should get together to question this race and caste and gender forms of discrimination. I stop here. Thank you so much, Barbara.
Well, thank you. And I think this is also, we will discuss this topic at the very end of the conference tomorrow. For today, I think it's been an intense day with a lot of interesting topics, but we've also already seen how the topics of the different panels interrelate. And well, for the moment, goodbye to those of you who are only online. Thank you for being with us and some of you getting up early in order to participate. For us, it's almost getting dark, but I hope we still have a chance to have a little walk through the beautiful gardens. And then we have dinner. So thank you all of you for the interesting debates, talks and discussions.